Hello and welcome back to my YouTube channel. In this video tutorial I will show how to code a C++ algorithm in Visual Studio in order to retrieve data using through an SQL query. I will show how to interface a C++ algorithm to Microsoft SQL Server in order to get data. So if you don't have an SQL Server, please watch my previous tutorial in which I show how to set up a Microsoft SQL Server and develop a database. Enjoy! Okay, so for this tutorial you need first of all Visual Studio, a Microsoft program that can be used to write and compile C++ algorithms. It can be downloaded for free from the Microsoft website www.visualstudio.com, and it is free, and it must be installed on your machine to follow this tutorial. Another thing that you need is a SQL server to which perform an SQL query. In my case, I showed in my previous tutorial how to set up an SQL server, and so I created a database called MyDB, which contains a table called people, which in turn contains two records, two names and two ages, and it is required that this SQL server can be accessed remotely using both Windows authentication mode and simply an SQL server authentication. So if you don't have a server to which you can send a query, just follow my previous tutorial and set up an SQL server database. Okay, so let's see how we can retrieve data from that database using C++. Let's create a folder called C++ and SQL. Okay, now go to your Visual Studio and create a new project. So choose Visual C++ project console application and place your project in the folder you just created. Let's call this application SQL example. Okay, choose console application, precompile header, and finish the wizard. And now here is your project, which is empty. First of all, you need to include several libraries, for example IOStream, and then Windows, then you need to include SQL extension, and then you need to include SQL types, and finally include simply SQL. Alright, so since we need to print out data on the console, in this C++ algorithm also use namespace std. So using namespace std. Alright, so if you don't know what this line does, just you can look it up on the internet and find other tutorials that can be make you more familiar with the C++ programming language. Okay, so before editing the main function, which is the function that is called when the algorithm starts, I want to create a function for that displays possible errors that can occur when you use SQL functions in C++. So this function will have no output, so just void, and let's call this function show SQL error. This function will have two inputs. The first is an unsigned integer and call it handle type. The second output is a constant of type SQL handle, and let's call it handle. Okay. First of all, I want to declare two variables that will be used in this function, SQL char, SQL state. So this is a variable of type SQL char and is an array of characters. It is called SQL state and it has a size of 1024. The second variable that I want to declare is also of SQL char type, but it is called the message. Okay, now I want to call a function which is called SQL get diagRec. Okay, what does this function do? If we look it up, if we Google it, we saw that this function basically performs a sort of diagnosis on the record that are the input of the function and put a message and a state in the variables SQL state and the message, which in my functions are in my function are SQL state and message. So I want to call this function to perform a diagnosis on handle type and handle to see what if there is any error and if there is any message resulting from a SQL function which affected handle type and handle. So the input of this function are indeed the handle type, handle, and there are other parameters that I set to standard values. So one SQL state, null message, the size, null again. Alright. So this function perform a diagnosis again on handle type handle and put the results of the diagnosis in SQL state and message, which afterwards will contain the state of the SQL handle and a message for a possible message for us explaining possible errors that occurred. Okay, so here you see that there is an error because we used the variable of a variable of type SQL char, which is incompatible with other parameters in this function, which are of SQL wchar. So, in order to solve this issue, just go to your Solution Explorer, right-click on your project properties, and change the character set to multi-byte. Apply. Oh, alright. Alright, so we see, make sure that you did it for the right platform and configuration. So we set this for platform of 64 architecture, which is that I wanted to use. So let's turn it let's turn your project to 64-bit architecture and also to release mode. Okay. Active release, and make sure again that your multi-byte character set is the one you use in your project. Alright. Okay, so now you can just print the SQL state and message on the console for the user. But we want to do it only when SQL get the diagnosis function is successful. So let's put this in an if statement. So if this function is equal to SQL success, then we can print the result. So in this case, I will use the standard method cout to print out message and the SQL state. So SQL driver message. Okay, so here we will print the string SQL driver message, and then we will print the message. Then in a new line we will print SQL state and print the actual SQL state. Then we will print on the console a dot, a full stop, and then go to a new line. Okay, so this function, to recap, this function will be used to show to perform a diagnosis on the variables handle type and handle, and print an error message or any message that or information that is contained in these two handles. Okay, now that we built this function, we can actually type our main code, which will be an algorithm that retrieves data from an SQL server. Okay, so let's create the variable for the environment handle, SQL handle, SQL environment handle, and initialize it to null. SQL handle, and then we need to create a variable that contains the connection handle. And finally, a variable that contains the statement handle. All three are initialized to null. Then we need another variable of type SQL return, which will be called readCode, and another variable. No, we are all set. Yes, another variable of type char SQL query. This variable is an array of characters. It's a string in which I want to put my SQL query. My SQL query is select all the records from table people. Alright. Okay. So now let's make a do cycle which will run until only once. And we need a do cycle in order to break the cycle if an error occurs. So the first thing we need to do is allocate the environment. And this is done using the function SQL alloc handle. As an input, it has SQL handle environment and SQL null handle, and finally a pointer to our environment handle. Alright, this is enough, but we want to see if this function results in an error. So let's put this again in an if statement. So if the result of this function is not success, then we need to break. So in this if statement, this function is executed and it allocates the environment and put the environment handle in SQL and handle the variable I declared at the beginning on the function and if the result of this function is an error, so it is different than from success, then we break the do cycle and we don't execute any other command. The second thing we need to do is to set the attributes that govern the aspects of the environment, and this is done using Sql Set Environment attribute. This function has a Sql environment handle as an input, and then Sql attribute ODBC version. Okay, then it requires an SQL pointer of SQL ODBC3 0. Okay, so this is a function with a standard input which sets the attributes that govern the environment. Again, I want to break the cycle if the result is an error. So I put this function in an if statement and break if the result is not success. The next thing that I need to do is allocate the connection, and this is done with SQL allocate the handle. All right. This is again performed with allocate handle. Alright, and as an input we have SQL environment handle. No, sorry, in this case is SQL handle DBC. The second input is SQL environment handle, and finally a pointer to SQL connection handle. Again, let's break the cycle if the result is not a success. Alright. Okay, next we need to set the attributes of the connection, and this is done using Sql Set Connection Attributes. The first input of this function is SQL connection handle. The second is SQL login timeout. SQL pointer 50. Alright. So with this function I set the timeout for the connection. Again, I put this in an if statement. Which can break the cycle if some error occurs. Okay, the next step is to create a variable for the connection string, which is SQL char. Let's call it readCon string. It's an array of characters, so it is a string. And I actually want to connect. So in this case, I need the function SQL driver connect. The first input is the SQL connection handle. The second is null. Then we need an SQL char with a declaration of a statement containing the driver of the SQL server, which I will fill afterwards. SQL NTS readCon string. It has this function, it has a lot of standard inputs. Driver no prompt. Okay, so this function actually connects us to the database, to the SQL server. It has a lot of inputs. This is in order to avoid a prompt for the user. And here in this input, we need to specify the type, the port, and the login for the database I want to connect to. So in my case, the driver is SQL server. SQL server, alright. The server here is here you need to put the IP address of your server. In my case, the server is on my computer, so I will just put local host. Next, we need to specify the port. Then it comes to the database name, which is, as I said, my DB. The user ID is my ID. The password is my password. And this is a string that can be interpreted from SQL driver connect. So here again is the server type. In my case is SQL server. This is the IP address or local host if the database is on your computer. This is the port, the database name, the database user ID, and the password. As I said, this is my Microsoft SQL server. As you can see, my database is called MyDB, and the login is for my ID and has a password that you can set here, my password. Okay, so again we want to check what is the output of this function. So in this case we will use switch. So the output can be of several cases. And alright, so the first case is SQL success, and in this case I want simply to break the switch case. In case the output is SQL success with info, I again break the switch case. Then we can have that the database contains no data, so the result will be no data found. In this case we will show an error, and we will do it by calling the function that I created at the beginning of this tutorial. So I will want to show the error with SQL handle dbc and SQL connection handle. And this so if there is no data in the database, my function will show an error. Return code in this case will be set to -1, and then the switch cycle will be break. Another possible case if the handle is invalid, so SQL invalid handle, and this and we want to do the same as if the database contains no data. The same if a generic error is thrown. Alright. In all the other cases we will simply break, but we shouldn't find other cases actually. Okay, so at this point these break commands are just to break the switch, but if an error occurs we want also to break the do cycle. Fortunately we put red code here if an error occurs, and so after this the switch statement we need to break again if red code is -1. Okay. At this point we need again to allocate the statement, and in order to allocate this statement we needed to use the query SQL allocate handle. In this case we need to allocate the handle statement. Use SQL connection handle statement handle. So this function allocates this statement using the variable SQL connection handle, and it allocates this statement in SQL statements handle. Again, we want to check if an error occurs, and so we need to put this function is in an if statement. SQL success. So if the output is not a success, then the do cycle will be break, and then the program will end. The next thing we need to do is to execute the statement. So we need to use SQL exec direct, put the statement. SQL and here we will execute the query. Okay, again I want to put this in an if statement to check if an error occurs. Okay, if an error occurs, then we need to display the error. So show SQL error. Show the error and then break. Otherwise, so else, if the output of the function is a success, then we just need to print out the data that we find with this SQL query, which was defined at the beginning of the function. Okay, so if SQL exec direct is a success, then I declare a variable char name of size 256 and an integer age, which are the two variables that I expect to find with my SQL query in the table people. So name and age. The name of the two variables don't necessarily need to be the name that are in the database, but is just for simplicity. Okay, so now we need to create a while loop. And in the while loop, we need to fetch the result of the statement. And in order to fetch the next row set from the data that result from the query, I needed to use the command SQL fetch and provide the SQL statement handle as an input. And of course, we will print out the data if the result of this command is a success. Okay, so now that we have the data fetched, we need to retrieve the data using the command sql get data. I need to use the SQL statement handle, and in SQL get data, which retrieves data for a single column in the result set, we first need to use the statement handle. Then the second field is the row that I want to get the data from, and then is the type of the data, which I will in this case I will use SQL default, so that the SQL data type will be the default one for the given variable. The result will be put in name for the first row. Then I need the size of the variable, so a size of name. The last input is null. Okay, so to sum up, SQL get data retrieves from column 1 the name, a name, and it puts the result in the variable name of size of name. Okay, we expect two fields because we have two rows, and the second row is actually age, but otherwise the syntax is the same. Here you see we have two rows, name and age. Okay, now basically we got the data from the database. We just need to print the data out, and we do it using cout name and space age and line. So with this line we just print out the data. Okay, basically we have done. The only thing that we needed to do is to actually free the handles and free all the resources that we used and disconnect from the database. So we need to use SQL free handle, and first just free the handle statement. SQL statement. Okay. Then you need to disconnect the connection. Finally, free the connection handle. Finally, you need to free the environment handle. Okay, now if we run the program right now, we don't see any data because the console closes immediately after performing all the algorithm. So in order to freeze the data, freeze the console before it closes, I will use getChar. Okay, so let's see if everything works by hitting just running first build the algorithm. Okay, it's a successful, and now let's run the program. Okay, and so as you can see, we correctly retrieved the two the two fields from the SQL server. So I used an SQL server database containing two names, two ages, and with the C++ algorithm, I correctly got the data in the database. Okay, so this, of course, all these commands, all these functions can be embedded in more complex, more complicated programs in order to automatically retrieve data from SQL databases that can be on the same machine, same computer on which the algorithm is performed, or it can be also on another computer in the same network. Just if the database is not on your computer, just make sure that the firewall setup of your computer and the server is okay, and just put here the IP address of the computer in which the SQL server is located. Thank you for watching my tutorial, and see you next time.